Great. Well, hi, everyone. I'm Natty Zola. I'm a partner at Matchstick Ventures, and I'm super excited to be here doing this session on building a company from the inside out. And like I said, I'm gonna go through about 15 minutes worth of content here, but happy to answer questions as they come up. And we'll kind of get rolling. So thank you. Let's see here. I'm gonna switch over here. All right. So great. Maybe as a way to start this session here, I just want to talk a little bit around why I think this is important. So when you are starting a company, sometimes you can be really focused on the inside of the company, or more often than not, you're more focused on your customers and building the product. But what you may not realize is, really you as a team are at the center of the likelihood of your company succeeding. You as an individual, your team, and then your company and your community, all are these concentric circles out from you. And so part of the thesis that we have both at Matchstick Ventures and just in my experience running and scaling startups is you really have to look from the inside out to increase the odds of your company being successful. And this is a little counterintuitive because most of the time people are running startups, they're so focused on your customer, building your product and things like that, that you neglect to focus on the most important thing, which is you and your team. And so the thesis behind this talk is to build a great company, you really need to start from the inside out. And we're going to talk about why that's important. So first and foremost, why this matters is 65% of startups fail due to co-founder or interpersonal issues. So this isn't just, some fuzzy, feel good talk. Like this literally is the highest likelihood of your company failing is going to be from neglecting developing yourself and your team, and then something showing up in your co-founding team or for yourself that prevents you from being successful. So if you do want to be successful as an entrepreneur, this is an important place to spend some time and resources. And second to that, Google ran this really provocative study where they tried to figure out what teams were their top performing teams at Google and what was unique about them. And it wasn't what most people thought. It wasn't, who maybe was the best leader or the technical skill set of the team. The highest performing teams at Google had the highest sense of psychological safety. And so they saw a direct causal relationship between the psychological safety on a team and a high performance. And so, I kind of like looking at this concept from both these angles. First is if you want to be on the left here, if you want to be a high performing team, creating psychological safety is the number one thing you can do. And two, if you want to avoid risk of your startup failing, investing in your team and the leader is the highest. If you focus on that, you're going to prevent the highest likelihood of failure. So I think it's important context to kicking off this talk to understand this, and not that it's just sort of some sort of like fuzzy, stuff, especially when you're building your company and there can be so much stuff to focus on. So I want to focus a little bit here on the first circle here, which is you as a leader. And in our experience, having worked with over 100 companies, your actions and behaviors as the leader are the single greatest determinant of the culture you'll build, and that will be the biggest determinant of the success of your company. And so the big question that we like to ask is, how do you show up as a leader, and are you ready to be intentional about it? Or how intentional are you today about it? My hunch is, if you're like me, when I started my company, I didn't really think much about this, and I didn't really focus on how was I showing up as a leader. But as I grew as a leader within the company, I realized that was really important. So I think it's really helpful to start learning these practices early on so that you can build them into your culture and have this mindset from the get-go. And I will show you some tactical ways of doing this so that you can just take it into your startup. But I also think it's worth noting that there's no right way to build your own awareness and see how you show up in a company. It's more of a mindset, and then you'll find your own path and your own ways of doing it in your company. But I will go through some tactical stuff just to make sure this isn't just super high level. So I think there's this really cool framework to think about here, and this is called Johari's window. And it's basically a framework to understand yourself. And if you look here, so there's sort of like two axes on this. On the left side, there are things that are known to others about you, and there's stuff that's not known about you to others. And across the top, there's stuff that you know about yourself, and then there's stuff that you, on the left part of the top, and on the right part is stuff that you don't know about yourself. So if you look at that upper left quadrant, the green part here, this is stuff that's known to yourself about you and other people know about you. This tends to be what we call your open self. So this is things that are kind of obvious. Usually these are things that you're more like proud of about your personality and your traits. If you look at the top right compartment, which is kind of like an orangey color, this is stuff that maybe you don't know about yourself, but other people know about you. We call this the blind self. If you look at the lower left, the yellow color, this is things that you know about yourself, but you kind of prevent or don't want other people to know about you. And this is called the hidden self. So these are things that typically we're kind of like not proud of, or traits that we're just, aren't our favorite parts about ourselves. And then in the lower right, the blue part is stuff that's not known to yourself and not known to others. And this is sort of the unknown self. And I think it's helpful to realize like we all have many things in all of these areas. There's not a goal here to, be one way or the other. The goal is to shift yourself and increase the amount of, increase the open self category here. So this is learning more about yourself and also being more comfortable exposing who you really truly are to others, because then we don't have to have sort of these facades that we show up with that are really holding us back in terms of reaching our full potential, because we don't feel like we can be open with everyone around who we are. And so I like this framework because it sort of is like, okay, my goal here is not to totally like, eliminate the blind self, the hidden self, and the unknown self, but just shift and try to increase the surface area of that open self. And this is the first part of this whole building a company from the inside out, is you have to learn about who you are and what you're like, so that then you can really show up authentically for other people. And part of this process is what we call radical self-inquiry. So this is, I like this definition of it. It's the process by which self-deception becomes so skillfully and compassionately exposed that there's no mask that can hide it anymore. So this is really around just like putting yourself out there, really learning like who you are. What are your strengths and weaknesses? What do you, how do you show up in different situations? What are you proud of around how you show up? What are you not proud of? And just putting it all out there. And that sort of removes this mask that many of us carry around what we think other people want to perceive us like, how we want other people to perceive us. And it's kind of a little bit scary because you're sort of like putting yourself out there. But the more that you do it, the more you realize like we're all just, there are parts of ourselves that we're really proud of. There are parts that we aren't. And we're all trying to grow and evolve as people. And the best way to do that is to be more open with it. So it's a little uncomfortable to start. But what I've seen is once you start doing this, your personal growth and therefore the growth in your company just really starts accelerating. But it can be uncomfortable initially. So I want to go through a little bit here around what does radical self-inquiry and growing that open self actually look like in practice. And so I'm going to start with some stuff that's sort of easy that you can start doing today, and I'll get to some stuff that's a little bit harder. So the first thing that's easy is what we call red, yellow, green. And this is where you check in with yourself every day and say, am I red, am I yellow, or am I green? So maybe I'll start on the green side. So what green means is I have good energy today. I'm present. There's not much going on in my life that's distracting me in my personal life, maybe at work, or maybe my work life distracting in my personal life. But I'm generally like good and present. Yellow is I'm noticing that I'm somewhat distracted today. There's something going on in my personal life or in my work life that's not enabling me to be totally 100% and present today. And red is sort of like, I may be here, but I'm not here. So there's something significant that's distracting me or causing me to not be present today. And what I've found is that as leadership teams start to bring this check-in to themselves, and then also so understanding where are you at on any given day can start to give you a lot of context around your capacity that day and what may show up for you in terms of your personality. So if you're showing up, if you check in green to yourself, you're like, okay, I'm likely to be like quite productive today and creative and able to achieve my goals. If you realize, wow, I'm checking in red today, you might have a little more grace with yourself around how you perform that day. And that's not saying like, you're throwing that day away, like we still have work to do, but you're going to just have a little more context around it. And you can start to build some like boundaries in for yourself. So if you're checking in red, you may say, you know what, today's not a good day to do a performance review with one of my employees, or today is maybe not a good day to send that email to that person who, sort of gave me a hard time. Maybe it's not a good day to, reply to comments on Twitter around something that maybe is giving you energy, just because you're going to probably show up in not your best way. And so it's good to think, okay, I'm going to wait till a day where I'm green to do those things. And so first is like starting to build that awareness yourself, and then you can start bringing it into your team. And I think I'm jumping a little bit ahead here, but since we're talking about it, is then you can start to say in your daily check-ins with your team, like, how is everyone checking in? Are you red? Are you yellow? Are you green? And what's nice about that is if your team feels comfortable checking in honestly with each other, you may say like around the table, okay, green, green, yellow, red, green. And you don't have to give an explanation around why you're red. It might feel too personal or whatever, but you can if you want. That can help people, give you a little bit more empathy. But what you're really seeing then around the table is like, wow, okay, Jane is checking in red today. I'm going to go out of my way to help her on stuff. Or if she, acts in a way that I'm not like, I don't know, maybe isn't great, I'm gonna have some context for that. And it's like, okay, like something's going on in her life that's really like preventing her from really showing up today. And yeah, I'm just gonna be a little bit more gracious around it. I'm gonna have more empathy for it. So it's really powerful to get that context of how everyone is showing up on any given day. So I think it's an easy way to do it, to start to bring radical self-inquiry and increase that open self part of awareness in your company, because red, yellow, green is just an easy concept. I think we can all get it. It doesn't mean it's easy to really like show up and check in and be that open with each other, but I really would encourage you to start doing it at least for yourself and then with your team if you can. I most often see this show up as like a daily stand-up. It takes a few seconds. You go around your team and say, let's do red, yellow, green, and see how everyone's doing. It's really helpful to do it every day, because you want to have it. If it's just sort of like random, like, oh, why are we doing this red, yellow, green on this random Tuesday? Yes, that's better than nothing, but you're not getting to see like a trend line for people or, really build it into your practice. So I encourage you doing it every day. So I'm gonna go through a few other fun and easy ways to start building radical self-inquiry and this self-awareness into your company. So the next one is to start thinking about, there's different personality types and work styles across spectrums. So this one I like is, are you someone who tends to ride the emotional roller coaster of a startup or life, like, and you're really up or you're really down, and that's just a personality trait? Or are you more steady Eddie, like, you're kind of, I don't know, the highs aren't that high, the lows aren't that low. Neither of these is better, but this is just more context to understand, like, what's your style? So I remember one of the colleagues I worked with when I ran the Techstars Accelerator in Boulder, she was much more on the ups and downs. So the highs were really high for her and the lows were much lower. I'm a little bit more of a steady Eddie. So my highs are lower, my lows are higher. And it was just like interesting to see how that dynamic showed up in our work. And once we really understood where we were on the spectrum, we just had more awareness for each other around how we can better support each other in the workplace. Here's kind of a fun one. So another spectrum here can be, are you conflict seeking on the left side, or are you conflict avoidant on the right side? Another example, the woman I worked with at Techstars, she was very much conflict seeking. I'm pretty conflict avoidant. So once we understood that context for each other, our work was much easier together, because we would notice like, oh, hey, in this situation, Julie, her name is Julie, she's sort of pushing me because she's conflict avoidant. And I've noticed I'm sort of pulling away because I'm avoidant, she's conflict seeking. And what we realized was we started to build some vernacular into our process around, okay, like in this situation, like, Julie, I see you acting this way and I'm acting this way, like, let's come together more, because we saw this pattern of behavior in our company. And it just made it so that those moments where she was conflict seeking, I didn't feel attacked because I knew that was her style. And when she saw me pulling away, she was able to sort of change her behavior and invite me more into that conversation. And we were able to get to better results quicker. So another spectrum here that's kind of fun to think through is, are you a perfectionist on the left side here, or are you a satisfizer? So a perfectionist is someone who, I'll give you another example with Julie. So for me, when I wanted to ship a product, and this could be everything as simple as like an email we're sending out to our investors, or some product we actually built, it's like I wanted it to be 99% perfect before we sent it out. That was important to me. Julie, on the other hand, was more of a satisfizer. She thought, hey, if we're 80% of the way there, let's ship it and start getting data. And the reality is like neither of us are right on that. It's just a style. And once we realized where we each were on that spectrum, we could have really good conversations around, okay, this project, is this a 99% project or is this an 80% project? And she helped me grow. And so I didn't have to perfect everything. And she was right in many cases, like, hey, better to ship this earlier and get some data than it is to like spend the extra 3 weeks perfecting it. And sometimes I helped her grow by saying, hey, this isn't good enough. We're not going to get good data from it. We need to make it a little bit better. And it's more of a perfectionist style project. So just another spectrum that you can start to get to know your co-founders or your team on. And this context will help you really work better together. Next one here is, are you someone who tends to look at the world through rose-colored glasses on the left side? Maybe you're more of an optimist. Maybe on the right side, you tend to be maybe more of a cynic and think things are, you're maybe more of a pessimistic bias. Again, neither is better or worse. These are just styles. And this is radical self-inquiry, is starting to realize like, what is your style? What is your personality? And making that more in the open. So you're growing that open self so that other people know your style. And then you can better understand how to work with each other. So again, I would say Julie and I were at different places on the spectrum, and it was really helpful because we're like, okay, that's your home base. Let's build working styles together to make sure that these personality traits don't cause conflict or hold us back in our ability to make really good decisions. And you can come up with whatever, as many of these spectrums as you want. These are just a few that I wanted to share with you. And if you come up with some good ones in your company, I'd love to know about them, just because I think it's really fun to get to know each other. So I've gone through some easier ways of doing this radical self-inquiry. Here's some harder ways, which just take more time, maybe are digging a little bit deeper. So you can get into meditation. That's a really powerful way to learn about yourself. You can hire a coach. You can do some work around what triggers you or what sets you into the red. You can do something that a program called Conscious Leadership, which does a lot of this. You can journal. So journaling really helps you identify about yourself. You can do personality assessments, kind of like Myers-Briggs, Enneagram, the DISC profile. There's a lot of those that are really cool. You can just simply go through like, what are your strengths and what are your weaknesses, and start sharing those with each other. There's a cool framework called Love Languages, where you can figure out like, how do you relate to people? And then maybe the most sophisticated of this is the attachment styles, which is really around how did your upbringing determine how you engage and interact with people. That's really interesting. And I think one thing that's important to say at this point is we are who we are, and none of this is like better or worse. The whole goal here is more self-awareness and then personal growth to improve in the areas you want to improve, and also just like recognize like who you are. So like sometimes people are like, well, what's the optimal outcome here? And I think the optimal outcome is just doing the work and building it into your practice and your culture, not like trying to be, some perfect human, because that's not possible, as we all know. So we've talked a lot here about you as the leader, and these questions sort of help you answer the questions like, how do I show up? How am I showing up? What are my patterns? And maybe what do I want to change? And I think if you do this work and you build it into your culture, you're way more likely to build an amazing team and be the best version of yourself, which is honestly all we can hope for as entrepreneurs. And this leads to sort of our main statement in here, which is this personal growth is likely to drive professional growth. And in fact, like I think that's maybe the biggest lever that you can have, is the rate of growth of yourself needs to be faster than the growth of your company, so that you can scale with it and continue to be the best leader possible for it and have it achieve its in your ambition. So I'm not going to go too much into this, but I did want to highlight this sort of second layer here of this inside out framework, which is your team. And I would argue there's no more important relationship than between the co-founders. I mentioned earlier that 65% of startups fail due to some sort of interpersonal relationship issue, whether personally or within your team. So the main question here is, how are you showing up for each other? And as you've gotten to know yourself on a lot of those spectrums and those tools that I mentioned earlier, really like learning how that shows up in your team. So I talked about this earlier, but starting to do red, yellow, green as a team. So you get to know each other and how you're showing up on each given day, so that you have the context around how someone is doing that day, and you can better work together when you know that. And so really what this all does is, if you have this radical self-inquiry, which is understanding yourself, plus understanding the context of other people and how they're showing up, and you're just really open around it, this can lead to something called positive sentiment override. I think this is such a powerful concept, and frankly, it like shows up in my marriage, it shows up in my friendships, it shows up at work, which is positive sentiment override. The more of that you have, it's, do you give people the benefit of the doubt? Do you assume everyone is doing the best possible? And are you basically showing up with like sort of a loving, positive, constructive attitude? And the less of that you have is when you end up in these sort of negative spirals, either in your personal relationships or at work, where you sort of start to assume the negative or the worst case scenario for everyone because you don't know what's going on for them and you don't know who they are and you don't have this openness. And gosh, this really snowballs and gets like into trouble over time when you have, when you're on a team, especially when you're in a startup, because in a startup, you're in this like pressure cooker. It's like intense and you're trying to solve these things and do daunting challenges. You need positive sentiment override so that when you look at your co-founders or you look at your team, you really feel like very positive about them and know they're doing their best. I'll tell you, when I see companies that have a lot of this, it is just incredible to see the pace that they're able to execute at and what they're able to pull off. So quick recap on the team side of things, like you can start to answer questions like what triggers each of you? Like when you end up in conflict, like what does that look like? How do we fight? And do we want to be intentional about that? So instead of just like randomly disagreeing and blowing up and being pissed at each other, you have some frameworks to think about how do you do that? You can talk about like, what are your vulnerabilities with each other? And what are you like worried about? And you have a lot more openness. And you can get as sophisticated as deciding like, how do we greet each other? How do we depart? Like what's important to each of us in that process? And you'll just come together as a team and perform much more highly. And we believe that at the end of the day, it's important to put your relationships before the company, because if you don't have those relationships, the company's not going to succeed anyways. So I just want to come back to this comment here around psychological safety being the #1 determinant of high performing teams at Google. And what does this actually look like in practice? And so the two things that Google found that created psychological safety was colleagues felt like they were actually cared for by each other, and everyone spoke about the same amount in meetings. And so the tools that I've given you today are the best ways to, they're sort of the prescription to get this result. Because to get your colleagues to feel like they care for you, it's get to know each other, and like have context for each other, know what's going on in each other's lives. And if you do this red, yellow, green, or you understand the spectrum, it's more likely that people are going to speak about the same amount and feel comfortable sharing their opinions. So if you want to create psychological safety, which again is the #1 determinant of high performing teams, doing this company building from the inside out is your highest likelihood chance of doing it. And to wrap up here, we think building a great company is kind of like building a house, and you obviously can't do it without a great foundation. And this work is the foundation that's going to support your house or your company in the long run. So that's it in terms of the content that I had today. This is building a company, a great company from the inside out. You can reach me anytime at natty@matchstickventures.com, and I'm happy to take any questions that people have. So I noticed there's no questions here on the chat. So if anyone has a question, let me know. I see Tom, David, and David are sort of here potentially wanting to come on stage and ask a question. I'm going to invite you guys up. If that was an accident, you can just say hi and jump back down to your seat. But hey, Tom, just want to say hi and see if you had any questions.
Hi, how are you? Great presentation, Natty. I didn't have a question. Can you hear me? Actually, is my mic working all right?
Yeah, I can hear you great. Yep.
I really liked what you put together. Simply because I was thinking a lot to myself. My partner and I had founded a company back in 2000, and it grew huge. We did great, and we look back on it really fondly. We were able to have a really, really successful exit on that, and everything went great. And I look back on that so fondly. After that, we started to acquire and go into other companies and do that. And what I found was so different was that's a challenge to acquire and go in and take over a leadership role of where there's an existing culture and trying to implement a new culture that maybe has very, very long-standing traditions that ultimately as a new owner you feel like need to be changed. that's far more difficult than growing, utilizing the tools you have and being able to select people that kind of fit into that culture and that grow and expand with it rather than kind of implementing one. I found that to be a far more difficult challenge.
Yeah,
I just wholeheartedly
yeah, thank
concur with
you.
what you say in terms of like building it from the ground up. It's 100% true.
Well, that's the unique opportunity and challenge as a startup is you get to create all of this from scratch. And frankly, there's no right way of doing it. I would say argue the right way of doing it is the authentic way. And as a startup, you get to create your own culture. And I think I agree with the statements where actually your culture is your moat or your culture is your most important strategy, because that's what's going to create the value in your company. And as a startup, you get to do that from the beginning, which is great. I've actually had both experiences where I got to create a culture from the start. And then also I went into when my company got acquired, I got to sort of inherit a culture. And I will say that you can change a culture, but it's much harder than creating it from scratch, what you want. And I mean, it probably took us 2 years to sort of steer the big ship of our acquiring company's culture towards more what we wanted. And luckily they were very open to doing that and it was successful, but it's much harder than being intentional about it from the get-go in your company. So yeah. Thank you, Tom. I appreciate you sharing that story.
Absolutely.
I'm going to invite David up here and see if he wants to say anything. If anyone wants in the chat here, I'm curious if there were parts of the presentation that were either confusing for you that I could explain further, or if there were parts that really stood out as like, wow, this is the most important takeaway for me as an entrepreneur. If anyone wants to just like leave that in the chat, I'd be curious to learn from you what stood out. I see Amanda here said a question: when hiring, what are indicators that a person will contribute positively to your team? Can you recommend interview questions to ask to get to these issues? Yeah, hiring into a team is so hard because you want to get both a culture fit and a skill set fit. So one of my mentors is Brad Feld, and he once told me, he had this really nice diagram that kind of like blew my mind, which it was like a 4-blocker. So on one side you have culture fit, yes, no. And on the other axis you have skill set fit, yes, no. And the interesting thing that kind of like blew my mind was he asked, which quadrants do you make a hire in? And obviously no culture fit, no skill set fit, you don't hire that person. And obviously you want to hire where it's culture fit and skill set fit. But I also always thought that you wanted to hire someone who was culture fit, but not skill set, because I'm like, oh, you could always train them. Or you would maybe even make a hire which is not culture fit, but yes, skill set fit. His argument was you never hire either of those. You only ever hire people who are a culture fit and a skill set fit. Obviously on the culture fit side of things, you want people who fit your culture, or maybe it can be cultural ads for you and kind of grow your culture. That seems a little more obvious, but the skill set fit, if you hire yes for skill set fit, but no for culture fit, that tends to be the high performing asshole. And those people may do well for you, but they are going to erode your culture and be a big problem in the long run. And so he says that you have to go out of your way to only hire skill set fit and culture fit. So I share that initial framework, but then the question that you're really asking is, well, how do you figure out culture fit? And how do you make sure that people are a culture add to your company? So the first thing I would say is you have to really be intentional, like what is your culture as much as you can. So defining your mission, defining your values, and then you can come up with interview questions that show, that ask interview candidates to give examples of when they've exhibited the values that you have in your company. But you don't really want to ask the question that bluntly or that directly. Like you have to figure out what's a way to ask a question that doesn't appear to be like a direct, like, give me an example of a time when you had maybe a value of your company's is do the right thing. So like, instead of just asking, like, can you give me an example of a time you did the right thing? Like, could you ask a question in a more creative way and say, can you give me an example of a time when it was not obvious what to do and you had multiple options, one of which felt like was more aligned with the values of the company and one of which was not aligned with the values of the company. Give me an example of that situation and what'd you do? And that will help you find like ideally a story of someone who understands that you make decisions based on the values of the company. So unfortunately, I can't give you any exact interview questions because they'll be specific to your company and your values. But that's one place to start. The second place to start, and I'm not an HR lawyer, so I would encourage making sure that questions like these are legally allowed to be asked. But I would ask questions around how open people are, and see if there's examples where they're comfortable sharing with you their strengths and their weaknesses. And when you ask them those questions, do they give you honest answers, or do they give you kind of the standard like, well, I work too hard is my weakness? Like, yay, okay, like that's obviously not honest. But if you do ask someone like, how open are they? How vulnerable were they willing to get in an interview with you? For me, that's a huge plus. I think that most employers and most candidates don't actually want that per se. They feel like vulnerability or openness is actually like, keep that at home, or like when you walk through the doors of our office, put on your game face and we're going to perform. And I just think that that's outdated, frankly. Like the reality is there is no work-life balance anymore. There's only work-life harmony. Our work and our life are so intertwined. It is what it is. And what we would prefer is people to show up as their authentic selves, and really like, because if you show up as your authentic self, you're going to perform just much better. And if you're not a fit for the company, or the role's not a right fit, great, like we'll move on from that. But if you show up as your authentic self, we're going to be more likely to succeed. So I would say, maybe if you do ask those sort of generic, like what are your strengths and weaknesses, or those kind of questions, like just see who shows up as like truly honest and authentic, because that's I think who you want to hire. But I also would recommend, talk to an HR lawyer, because I know there's some questions that you legally cannot ask, and I don't want you to cross that line. So I don't know, Amanda, if that's helpful. If there's a follow-up question from that, happy to dive in a little bit more. Hey, Jen, I see a great question from you. How do you recommend imparting these concepts to leaders that aren't aware of them? Well, if you want to email me, I will send you this presentation. I'm going to put my email, that's .com, not .com. I will put my email in the chat here. I will send you this. And I think what I would do is I would say, I would start with one of those earlier slides, and I'm going to go back to it here. Like this is like data driven right here. These two stats I think are so powerful. Like literally Google, probably the best performing company of our generation, or this generation, analyzed all of their teams, and this is the #1 determinant to high performing teams. So if you want to have a high performing team, psychological safety is what matters. So I would start with that. And then this stat around 65% of startups fail due to co-founder issues. And this isn't just startups, right? This is teams. Like teams fail because of personality and interpersonal issues not being surfaced, and people not caring about each other. And I would say these two things are really important to you as a leader, and you want to be on the highest performing team as possible and give your team the best chance of success. And therefore, you want to invest resources in that. And if they're not open to that or not interested in that, my hunch is that may not be a place you want to work, because they maybe don't want high performing teams. They just want to have more of a command and control style of leadership, which I think is, again, outdated and unlikely to have you achieve your potential. And you want to de-risk a company. So I think the way I would start with this is I would show up and I would say, hey, I want us to perform really, really well. And I think we can be better based on these two stats. I think we can evolve our culture. And then, you can literally take my presentation and say, here's this cool presentation I saw, let's do this stuff. And then you could start just bringing it in. Like the easiest thing to do is just start doing red, yellow, green, and just be really consistent around that and see how that shows up and really changes the internal dynamics on your team. And then maybe start doing some of those other like self-awareness things and see how you as a team perform. And I guarantee you your team is going to perform so much better. So that's how I would do it. I tend to think like start with the facts, start with the objective viewpoint here, and then express your needs and desires around it and say you want to perform at a higher level. And then here's the tools to do it. And like I said, if a leader is unwilling or uninterested in like at least exploring this, that may not be a place where I would be thrilled to work, because I think we all want to show up as our authentic selves and do great work and be successful. And this is how you do it in my experience. Jen, I'm not sure if that fully answered your question. If you have follow-up, feel free to add them in the chat here and I can answer a little bit further. Thank you. What other questions do you all have? As I mentioned, I'm happy to send these slides around so you have them as a reference. And if anyone has questions around this, or you have experiences with it, or you end up taking some of this stuff and doing it, I would love to hear from you. You can email me and let me know how it's going, whether good, bad, what's working, what's not working. But I will say, I've now invested in over 100 companies. Not all of them do this. Everyone, and even the ones that sort of have leaned into this, do it their own way. But I see a big difference in the performance of the companies that care about leadership development, that care about team development, that care about encouraging people to show up as their authentic selves. And I really encourage you all to figure out what that means for you and your company. It can be just a super, just bring red, yellow, green in. Or if you want to go in super deep, sign your leadership team up for conscious leadership training, or have everyone do an Enneagram and discuss those results, or whatever. Like, there's a lot of really fun ways to build this into your culture. And I also can guarantee you, not only will this help you perform better in your organization, the self-awareness is just so cool and so interesting.